The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace. At exactly 6 in the morning, the massive iron gates opened with their familiar creak, and tourists began gathering outside the famous black railings. They came from all corners of the world, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family or witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. But the real stars of the show were already in position. Standing perfectly still in their bright red tunics and towering black bearskin hats, the Queen's Guards had taken their posts hours earlier. To the casual observer, they looked like living statues, their faces hidden beneath the shadow of their ceremonial headwear, their bodies rigid as marble sculptures. What most people didn't realize was the incredible dedication and sacrifice required to maintain this perfect stillness. These weren't actors dressed up for a show. These were highly trained soldiers, members of elite infantry regiments who had earned the honor of protecting the royal residences through years of service and exceptional conduct. The training to become a Queen's Guard was unlike anything most people could imagine. For months, recruits learned to stand motionless for hours at a time. They practiced ignoring everything around them, the clicking of camera shutters, the chatter of tourists, even physical discomfort that would make ordinary people fidget or move. During training, instructors would test their resolve in every possible way. They would shout in their faces, trying to provoke a reaction. They would place distractions nearby, testing whether the recruits would break their concentration. Some training sessions involved standing perfectly still, while instructors created loud noises, flashed bright lights, or even had people walk directly in front of them making silly faces or rude gestures. The rules were simple but absolute. A Queen's Guard must never speak while on duty unless addressing a direct security threat. They must never move except to patrol their designated route or respond to a genuine emergency. They must never acknowledge tourists, answer questions, or react to provocations. Their job was to be an immovable force, a symbol of the unwavering strength and dignity of the British monarchy. Breaking these rules carried serious consequences. A guard who smiled at a tourist's joke could face a formal reprimand. Someone who moved to swat away a persistent bee might find themselves reassigned to less prestigious duties. In the most serious cases, guards who repeatedly broke protocol could lose their position entirely, ending a military career they had worked years to build. The physical demands were just as challenging as the mental ones. The famous red tunics were made of thick wool that became unbearably hot during summer months. The bearskin hats weighed several pounds and sat heavily on their heads for hours at a time. During winter, guards stood exposed to freezing rain and bitter winds, their faces numb with cold, but their posture remaining perfectly straight. Many guards developed their own mental techniques to cope with the demands of the job. Some would focus on a single point in the distance, letting their minds wander while their bodies remained perfectly controlled. Others would recite poems or songs silently to themselves, anything to make the hours pass more quickly. A few learned to meditate while standing, finding a kind of peace in the stillness that their role demanded. The most challenging part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the strict rules. It was maintaining their humanity while appearing completely inhuman to the outside world. Underneath those red uniforms were ordinary people with families, feelings, and natural instincts to help others or respond to unusual situations. Every guard had stories of moments that tested their resolve. Children would try to make them laugh by making funny faces or telling jokes. Elderly tourists would ask for directions, genuinely needing help navigating the busy streets of London. Sometimes people would collapse from heat exhaustion or have medical emergencies just meters away from where a guard stood motionless. The emotional weight of ignoring human suffering was perhaps the hardest part of the job. Guards were trained to radio for assistance when they witnessed emergencies, but they were forbidden from leaving their posts to help directly. They had to watch paramedics arrive and tend to someone who might have been saved precious minutes earlier if the guard had been allowed to act. Despite these challenges, most guards took immense pride in their role. They understood that they were part of a tradition stretching back centuries, representing the very best of British military discipline and dedication. Tourists from around the world came specifically to see them, and their unwavering composure became a symbol of reliability and strength that people found comforting in an increasingly chaotic world. The selection process for becoming a Queen's Guard was extremely competitive. Only soldiers with exceptional service records were even considered for the position. They had to demonstrate not just physical fitness and military skills, but also the mental fortitude to handle the unique pressures of the role. Many applicants were rejected not because they lacked ability, but because psychologists determined they might struggle with the emotional demands of appearing completely unresponsive to human interaction. Once selected, guards underwent months of specialized training at the Guards Depot. Here, they learned the precise movements required for ceremonial duties, practiced marching in perfect synchronization, and developed the mental discipline necessary to maintain their composure under any circumstances. The training was designed to strip away individual personality and create a uniform standard of excellence that every guard would maintain regardless of their personal feelings or circumstances. The irony was that these were often some of the most compassionate and dedicated soldiers in the British Army. Many had joined the military, specifically because they wanted to serve others and protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Yet their most visible role required them to suppress these very instincts, creating an internal conflict that every guard had to learn to manage. Families of Queen's Guards often struggled to understand the demands of the job. Spouses would see their partners come home emotionally drained from hours of forced stillness and isolation. Children would ask why their parent couldn't wave at them when they came to watch the ceremony. The guards had to learn to separate their professional duties from their personal lives, switching between the role of immovable statue and caring family member. The public generally respected the guards' dedication, but there were always those who saw their stillness as a challenge to overcome. Some tourists would do increasingly outrageous things to try to provoke a reaction, not understanding that they were asking someone to risk their career for entertainment. Others would become frustrated when guards couldn't provide directions or answer questions, not realizing that the guard's silence was a professional requirement, not rudeness. What most people never saw were the moments when guards' humanity showed through despite their training. A barely perceptible nod to acknowledge a veteran's salute. Eyes that tracked a lost child until security could intervene. The slight tightening of facial muscles when someone nearby was clearly in distress. These tiny signs of human emotion, invisible to casual observers but meaningful to those who looked closely, revealed that underneath the ceremonial uniform stood real people with real feelings. This was the world that every Queen's Guard inhabited, a place where duty and humanity existed in constant tension, where the greatest challenge wasn't standing still for hours, but learning when the rules that defined their role might need to bend in the face of basic human decency. It was a typical Tuesday morning in late spring when everything changed for Guard Thompson. The weather was perfect, warm enough for tourists to feel comfortable standing outside the palace gates for hours, but not so hot that the heavy wool uniform became unbearable. Crowds had been gathering since dawn, with families positioning themselves for the best view of the day's ceremonies. Thompson had been on duty for just over an hour when he first noticed the little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with curly brown hair tied up in colorful ribbons and a bright yellow dress that seemed to capture the sunshine itself. She stood with what appeared to be her grandparents, an elderly couple who were clearly tourists based on their cameras and guidebooks. The girl was different from most children who visited the palace. While other kids would run around excitedly or try to get the guards' attention with silly faces and loud noises, she seemed genuinely fascinated by the ceremony itself. She watched everything with wide, curious eyes, asking her grandmother questions in a voice soft enough that Thompson couldn't make out the words, but loud enough to hear the genuine wonder in her tone. What Thompson didn't immediately realize was that the little girl had Down syndrome. Her grandmother had been explaining the importance of the guards, telling her how they protected the Queen and kept everyone safe. The child listened with the kind of pure attention that adults rarely possess, absorbing every word as if it were the most important information she had ever received. As the morning progressed, Thompson found himself occasionally glancing toward the family. The little girl's behavior was so different from the usual chaos of tourist children that it was hard not to notice. She never tried to distract him or make him break character. Instead, she seemed to understand instinctively that his job was important and serious. Around mid-morning, something unusual happened. The girl noticed a small patch of wildflowers growing near the base of the palace fence. These weren't part of the carefully manicured royal gardens, but rather hardy little blooms that had sprouted up in a crack in the pavement. While her grandparents were busy taking photographs of the guards, she quietly picked one of the tiny yellow flowers. Thompson watched from the corner of his eye as she examined the flower carefully, turning it this way and that in the sunlight. She seemed to be making some kind of decision about it, though he couldn't imagine what might be going through her mind. Her grandparents were still distracted, comparing photos on their cameras and consulting their guidebook about the next ceremony time. Without warning, the little girl stepped away from her family and began walking directly toward Thompson. His training immediately kicked in. This was exactly the kind of situation they had prepared for, a tourist, albeit a very small one, approaching his post. The protocol was clear: maintain position, avoid eye contact, and wait for the child to lose interest and return to their guardians. But something felt different about this situation. The girl wasn't running or being loud or disruptive like most children who approach the guards. She walked with purpose, holding the small flower carefully in her cupped hands as if it were made of glass. When she reached the edge of Thompson's post, she stopped and looked up at him with the most sincere expression he had ever seen. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Thompson kept his face perfectly neutral, as he had been trained to do, but behind his eyes he found himself genuinely curious about what this unusual little visitor was planning to do. The girl studied his face for a few seconds, then smiled. Not the mischievous grin of a child planning trouble, but the warm, open smile of someone who had decided he was a friend. Very gently, she extended her small hands toward him, offering the tiny yellow flower she had picked. "For you," she said in a clear, sweet voice that carried just far enough for him to hear. "Because you work so hard to keep everyone safe." Thompson felt something inside his chest that he hadn't experienced during months of guard duty. This wasn't a tourist trying to get a reaction for entertainment. This wasn't someone testing his discipline or trying to make him break protocol for a funny photo. This was a pure, innocent gesture of gratitude from someone who somehow understood the importance of his role better than most adults. The moment stretched out like a lifetime. Thompson knew exactly what he was supposed to do. Protocol demanded that he ignore the child completely, maintain his position, and wait for her to give up and walk away. Any acknowledgement of her gesture, no matter how small, could result in disciplinary action. He had seen other guards face consequences for much smaller breaches of conduct. But looking down at this little girl, holding up a flower that she had chosen specifically for him, Thompson made a decision that would change everything. Moving just his eyes, he looked directly at her face. Then barely perceptibly, he nodded. It was the smallest possible movement, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, but it was unmistakably an acknowledgement of her gift. The little girl's face lit up with pure joy. She carefully placed the flower at the base of his post, right where he could see it throughout the rest of his duty. "Thank you for protecting us," she whispered, then turned and skipped back to her grandparents, who had finally noticed she had wandered off. Thompson spent the rest of his shift looking down at that tiny yellow flower. It seemed impossible that something so small could carry so much meaning. Every time he felt the weight of his uniform or the strain of standing motionless, he would glance down at the flower and remember the genuine appreciation in the little girl's voice. What Thompson didn't know was that several tourists had witnessed the entire exchange. Within hours, photos and videos of the moment began appearing on social media. The images showed the little girl approaching the guard, offering her flower and receiving that brief but unmistakable nod of acknowledgement. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments poured in from people around the world, praising both the child's sweet gesture and the guard's moment of humanity. Many people shared their own stories of small acts of kindness that had meant everything to them. Parents wrote about how they hoped their own children would show such thoughtfulness and respect, but not everyone was pleased with what had happened. Within the military hierarchy, Thompson's moment of acknowledgement was seen as a clear violation of protocol. His commanding officers faced a difficult decision about how to respond to behavior that had technically broken the rules, but had generated such positive public reaction. The little girl's family, meanwhile, had no idea that their granddaughter's simple act of kindness had sparked an international conversation about humanity and duty. They continued their vacation, visiting other London attractions, while their granddaughter carried the memory of the nice guard who had accepted her flower. For Thompson, the experience marked a turning point in how he thought about his role. He had always understood that he was serving something larger than himself, But the encounter with the little girl helped him realize that sometimes the most important service involved recognizing the humanity in others, even when it meant bending the rules that usually governed his behavior. The yellow flower remained at his post until the end of his shift. When his replacement arrived, Thompson carefully picked it up and tucked it into his personal belongings. Years later, he would still have that pressed flower, a reminder of the day when a child's innocence and kindness had shown him that there were moments when being human mattered more than following every rule perfectly. The incident would become one of many that gradually changed how the royal household thought about the balance between maintaining tradition and acknowledging the fundamental humanity of the people who served in these ceremonial roles. But for Thompson, it was much simpler than that. It was the day he learned that sometimes the greatest act of service is simply letting someone know that their kindness has been seen and appreciated. The summer heat at Windsor Castle was particularly intense that July afternoon. Guard Rodriguez had been at his post for nearly 3 hours, and despite his years of training, he could feel sweat building up under his heavy ceremonial uniform. The wool tunic that looked so impressive to tourists felt like wearing a thick blanket in an oven when the temperature climbed above 80 degrees. Hundreds of visitors wandered through the castle grounds, most of them elderly tourists who had saved for years to make this trip to England. Tour groups moved slowly through the historic courtyards, with guides explaining centuries of royal history while participants snapped photos and asked questions about everything from architecture to the daily life of modern royalty. Rodriguez had learned to tune out most of the conversations around him, but he couldn't help noticing one particular visitor who seemed to be struggling with the heat. An older gentleman, probably in his 70s, was walking more slowly than the rest of his tour group. He kept pausing to wipe his forehead with a handkerchief and seemed to be breathing more heavily than the mild walk through the castle grounds should have required. The man was clearly trying to keep up with his wife and the rest of their group, but Rodriguez could see that he was having difficulty. His face was flushed red and he kept loosening his collar as if he couldn't get enough air. Several times the man stopped completely and leaned against a wall or railing, waving off his wife's concerned questions with reassurances that he just needed a moment to catch his breath. As a trained soldier, Rodriguez had received basic medical training that helped him recognize the signs of heat exhaustion and more serious conditions. What he was observing in this tourist went beyond simple discomfort from warm weather. The man's color was wrong, his breathing was labored, and his movements were becoming increasingly unsteady. According to protocol, Rodriguez's responsibilities were clear. He was stationed at his post to provide security and maintain the ceremonial dignity of the royal residence. If he observed a medical emergency, he should radio for assistance and continue to monitor the situation while remaining at his assigned position. Under no circumstances should he abandon his post to provide direct assistance. The elderly tourist's condition continued to deteriorate. Rodriguez watched as the man fell further behind his group, eventually stopping completely near a bench about 20 meters from the guard's position. The man sat heavily, his breathing now clearly labored, and began clutching at his chest in a way that sent alarm bells ringing in Rodriguez's mind. This was no longer simple heat exhaustion. The symptoms Rodriguez was observing suggested something much more serious, possibly a heart attack. The man's wife had noticed his distress and was hurrying back toward him, but she was elderly herself and moved slowly. The tour group was continuing without them, and other tourists in the area seemed unaware that anything was wrong. Rodriguez faced an impossible choice. His training told him to radio for medical assistance and wait for paramedics to arrive. The nearest emergency responders were probably 10 minutes away, and in a situation like this, every minute could mean the difference between life and death. But leaving his post would be a serious breach of protocol that could end his military career. The moment of decision came when the elderly man suddenly stood up from the bench, took 2 unsteady steps, and collapsed completely onto the stone pavement. His wife screamed, a sound that cut through all the tourist chatter and immediately drew the attention of everyone nearby. Rodriguez could see that the man was unconscious, his body completely limp against the ground. Without hesitation, Rodriguez broke from his position and ran toward the fallen tourist. His ceremonial sword bounced against his leg as he moved, and his heavy boots echoed against the stone courtyard. Behind him, He could hear the shocked gasps and excited chatter of tourists who had never seen a Queen's Guard break character, much less abandon his post completely. Reaching the unconscious man, Rodriguez immediately began checking for vital signs. The tourist had no pulse that he could detect, and he wasn't breathing normally. Rodriguez had been trained in CPR during his military service, and he knew that brain damage from lack of oxygen could begin within minutes. There was no time to wait for professional medical help. Kneeling beside the man in his full ceremonial uniform, Rodriguez began chest compressions. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, dressed in one of the most formal and traditional uniforms in the British military, performing emergency first aid on a tourist in full view of hundreds of people with cameras. The man's wife knelt beside them, tears streaming down her face as she watched Rodriguez work to save her husband's life. Other tourists formed a circle around them, some filming the unprecedented scene of a royal guard performing CPR, others calling out offers to help or asking if someone had called for an ambulance. Rodriguez continued the chest compressions with mechanical precision, counting each one silently while monitoring the man's condition for any signs of improvement. His formal training took over completely, and he found himself performing the life-saving procedure with the same attention to detail and unwavering focus that he brought to his ceremonial duties. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the man suddenly gasped and began breathing on his own. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around in confusion at the crowd of people surrounding him. Rodriguez helped him into a more comfortable position, while continuing to monitor his breathing and pulse. By this time, paramedics had arrived and were taking over the man's care. They praised Rodriguez for his quick thinking and professional response, explaining that his immediate action had likely saved the tourist's life. The man was conscious and stable, though he would need to be taken to the hospital for further evaluation and treatment. As the ambulance drove away with the tourist and his grateful wife, Rodriguez suddenly realized the magnitude of what he had just done. He had abandoned his post, broken protocol, and performed unauthorized medical care while in uniform. Technically, he had violated several military regulations simultaneously, any one of which could result in serious disciplinary action. The crowd of tourists who had witnessed the entire incident began approaching Rodriguez with thanks and congratulations. Many of them had recorded the rescue on their phones and were already posting videos online with captions praising the guard's heroic actions. Within hours, the footage would be viewed by millions of people around the world. Rodriguez returned to his post and resumed his ceremonial duties, but he knew that his actions would have consequences. Sure enough, within a few hours, he was called to meet with his commanding officers to explain why he had abandoned his position without authorization. The disciplinary hearing was unlike anything the military hierarchy had experienced before. On one hand, Rodriguez had clearly violated protocol by leaving his post without permission. On the other hand, he had saved a man's life using skills he had learned as a soldier, and the public response to his actions had been overwhelmingly positive. The case became even more complicated when the tourist's family contacted the palace to express their gratitude. The man had indeed suffered a major heart attack, and doctors confirmed that Rodriguez's immediate CPR had prevented permanent brain damage and quite possibly death. The family requested permission to thank Rodriguez personally and to nominate him for recognition for his life-saving actions. Media coverage of the incident sparked a broader conversation about the role of ceremonial guards and whether their duties should ever supersede basic human obligations to help others in medical emergencies. Many people argued that Rodriguez's actions exemplified the best values of military service, protecting and serving others regardless of personal consequences. Military officials found themselves in an unprecedented situation. While they couldn't ignore the breach of protocol, they also couldn't reasonably punish someone for saving a life. The case forced them to examine whether their regulations adequately accounted for genuine emergency situations where human life was at stake. Rodriguez himself remained conflicted about his actions. He knew he had done the right thing morally, but he also understood the importance of military discipline and following orders. He worried that his decision might set a precedent that could undermine the strict standards that made the ceremonial guard program so respected worldwide. The resolution of his case would ultimately influence how similar situations were handled in the future, and whether the rigid protocols governing royal guards could be modified to allow for basic humanitarian responses without compromising the dignity and effectiveness of their ceremonial. Rolf, the elderly tourist, made a full recovery and returned home with a story that would define the rest of his life. The day a royal guard broke every rule in the book to save him from a heart attack. The state ceremony at Buckingham Palace was one of the most important events of the year. Foreign dignitaries, government officials, and members of the royal family would all be participating in a formal procession that required absolutely perfect security and coordination. Guard Williams had been selected for this prestigious assignment based on her exemplary service record and unshakable composure under pressure. Thousands of spectators lined the ceremonial route, having arrived hours early to secure the best viewing positions. Barriers had been set up to keep the crowds at a safe distance from the procession, and security personnel were stationed throughout the area. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed multiple times to ensure the event would proceed without any disruptions. William stood at attention near one of the key security checkpoints, her role being to monitor the crowd and watch for any unusual activity that might pose a threat to the ceremony. The bright morning sun reflected off the polished buttons of her uniform, and her rifle was held in perfect position according to ceremonial protocol. About 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Williams noticed a commotion developing in the crowd near her position. A woman was moving frantically through the gathered spectators, clearly searching for something or someone. Unlike the excited but orderly behavior typical of ceremony attendees, this woman showed obvious signs of panic and distress. The woman was probably in her early 30s, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a small backpack that suggested she was a tourist rather than a local resident. She kept calling out a name. "Tommy. Tommy, where are you?" While pushing through the crowd with increasing desperation, other spectators were beginning to notice her behavior and step aside to let her pass. Williams maintained her position but watched the situation carefully. Lost children at large public events were unfortunately common, and security protocols existed for handling such situations. The woman's behavior suggested she had lost track of a child, probably her son based on the name she was calling. This type of incident usually resolved quickly once security personnel became involved. But as minutes passed, Williams could see that the woman's panic was escalating rather than subsiding. She was now stopping other spectators, grabbing their arms and asking if they had seen a little boy. Her voice was becoming louder and more frantic, and tears were beginning to stream down her face. This was clearly moving beyond a simple case of a child wandering a few steps away from his parent. The woman eventually reached the security barrier near Williams's position. She stood there for a moment, looking desperately in all directions, then noticed the guard standing nearby. Despite the obvious formality of William's ceremonial role, the mother approached her with the kind of desperation that overrides normal social boundaries. "Please," the woman said, her voice breaking with emotion. "My little boy is missing. His name is Tommy. He's only 4 years old. He was right beside me just a few minutes ago, and now I can't find him anywhere. Have you seen him? He's wearing a red shirt and blue shorts." Williams faced a dilemma that her training hadn't specifically addressed. According to protocol, she should not engage in conversation with members of the public during ceremonial duties. Her role was to maintain security through vigilance and professional bearing, not to interact with individual spectators. The proper procedure would be to direct the woman to nearby security personnel who could assist with the missing child situation. However, Williams could see that this was genuinely a mother in crisis, not a tourist trying to engage her in casual conversation. The woman's distress was clearly authentic, and every minute that passed increased the potential danger to a missing 4-year-old child in such a crowded environment. Williams made a quick decision that bent protocol without completely breaking it. While maintaining her formal position and not turning away from her assigned area of surveillance, she spoke quietly to the mother. "Ma'am, I understand your concern. I need you to immediately contact the security checkpoint over there," she said, indicating a location about 50 meters away where uniformed officers were stationed. The mother looked in the direction Williams had indicated, then back at her with continued panic. "But what if he's not over there? What if he's somewhere else? There are so many people here and he's so small. He could be anywhere by now." Her voice was rising again. and other spectators were beginning to turn their attention toward the interaction. Williams knew that if this situation escalated further, it could disrupt the entire ceremony. A panicked mother searching through a crowd of thousands could create exactly the kind of security concern that her presence was meant to prevent. More importantly, a 4-year-old child loose in such a massive crowd was genuinely in danger. Making another careful decision, Williams used her radio to quietly alert security about the missing child situation, while continuing to scan her assigned area. She provided a description of the boy and suggested that personnel throughout the ceremonial area be notified to watch for him. This allowed her to help coordinate the search while technically remaining within her duties as a security observer. The mother stood near Williams's position, frantically scanning the crowd while security personnel began organizing a more systematic search. Williams found herself in the unusual position of providing reassurance to a distraught parent while maintaining her ceremonial role and continuing to monitor for security threats. Security teams are looking for him now, Williams said quietly. Children his age usually don't wander far, and they're often drawn to colorful or interesting things. Are there any particular attractions or activities he especially likes? The mother thought for a moment through her panic. He loves horses and music. He always stops to watch when there are bands playing or horses anywhere nearby. This information was immediately helpful, as there were mounted ceremonial units preparing to participate in the procession, and a military band was rehearsing not far from their location. Williams relayed this information through her radio, suggesting that search teams focus on areas where the child might have been attracted by horses or music. Within minutes, she received confirmation that security personnel were checking those areas systematically. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 15 minutes, and Williams could see the tension building among the organizational staff. A missing child situation had the potential to delay or disrupt the entire event, affecting schedules that had been planned months in advance and involving dozens of high-ranking officials. Suddenly, Williams' radio crackled with an update. Missing child located near the ceremonial stables. Child is safe and unharmed. Reuniting with mother now. The relief that Williams felt was immediately reflected in the mother's face as she overheard the radio communication. Within minutes, a security officer approached their position, holding the hand of a small boy in a red shirt and blue shorts. The child appeared completely unconcerned about the panic he had caused, chattering excitedly about the pretty horses he had found. His mother dropped to her knees and swept him into a hug that seemed to last forever. Through her tears of relief, the mother looked up at Williams. "Thank you so much. I know you weren't supposed to help me, but you did anyway, and I'll never forget that." She stood up, still holding her son tightly. "You helped save my baby." Williams maintained her professional composure, but she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her small deviation from strict protocol had contributed to reuniting a family. The ceremony proceeded on schedule, and the missing child incident became just another example of the complex security coordination required for major royal events. Later, Williams would learn that the little boy had indeed been attracted by the ceremonial horses and had wandered away while his mother was distracted by the crowd activity. He had been completely safe the entire time, being watched by stable personnel who had assumed he was part of an official family group until the security alert went out. The incident highlighted the challenge that ceremonial guards faced in balancing their formal duties with basic human instincts to help others in distress. Williams had found a way to assist without abandoning her post or compromising security, but it required making quick judgment calls that weren't explicitly covered in her training. Her commanding officers later commended her for handling the situation appropriately, noting that she had managed to help resolve a family emergency while continuing to fulfill her ceremonial and security responsibilities. The incident became a case study in how guards could respond to humanitarian situations without compromising their primary duties. For the mother and her son, the day became a cherished memory of how a royal guard had shown kindness during a moment of crisis, proving that even the most formal military traditions could accommodate basic human compassion when it was truly needed. The morning air carried a crisp autumn chill as crowds gathered for the weekly changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Among the usual mix of tourists and locals, Guard Patterson noticed an elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed slowly through the crowd by a young man who appeared to be his grandson. What immediately caught Patterson's attention wasn't just the wheelchair, but the military bearing of the elderly man, despite his obvious physical limitations. Even seated, the old gentleman maintained an upright posture that spoke of decades of military discipline. His gray hair was neatly combed, and he wore a navy blue blazer adorned with several small military pins and medals that glinted in the morning sunlight. The young man pushing the wheelchair was clearly devoted to his grandfather, carefully navigating through the crowd while providing a steady commentary about the ceremony they were about to witness. "Grandpa, we're getting close to the front now. You'll have a perfect view of the guards when they march past." Patterson had been standing at his ceremonial post for about 45 minutes when the pair finally reached a position directly in front of him. The elderly man's eyes immediately focused on Patterson's uniform, and his weathered face showed the kind of recognition that comes from deep personal experience with military service. "Look at that young soldier, Tommy," the old man said to his grandson, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had once commanded troops himself. "See how perfectly his uniform is maintained? See that bearing? That's what we called soldier's pride back in my day." The grandson leaned down to hear his grandfather better. "Were you in the same regiment as these guards, Grandpa?" "Indeed I was, lad. Coldstream Guards, 1943 to 1947. Served right here at this very palace for 2 years after the war ended. Different uniforms back then, but the same pride, the same dedication." The old man's eyes never left Patterson as he spoke, and there was something in his gaze that suggested he was seeing not just the current ceremony, but memories of his own service decades earlier. Patterson maintained his required stillness, but he couldn't help being moved by the conversation he was overhearing. This wasn't just any tourist admiring the pageantry. This was a brother in arms, someone who had stood where Patterson now stood, carrying the same responsibilities and upholding the same traditions. As the ceremony continued, Patterson began to notice details about the elderly veteran that confirmed his military background. The man's hands, despite his age and obvious health challenges, remained positioned correctly on his wheelchair armrests in a manner that suggested lifelong military habits. When other spectators became rowdy or pushed too close, the veteran would give them a look that immediately restored order around his wheelchair. The grandson continued asking questions about his grandfather's service, and the old man's answers painted a picture of a young soldier who had served with distinction during some of the most challenging years in British history. He had been part of the ceremonial guard detail that protected the royal family during the uncertain years immediately following World War II. "Grandpa, do you think that guard can hear us talking?" the grandson asked. "Oh, he can hear every word, Tommy. These guards are trained to be aware of everything happening around them, even when they look like they're not paying attention. That's part of what makes them so good at their job." The veteran's understanding of Patterson's role was clearly based on personal experience rather than tourist guidebooks. As the formal ceremony began, Patterson watched the elderly man's reaction to the familiar drill movements and ceremonial procedures. Despite being confined to a wheelchair, the veteran's body language showed that he was mentally performing every movement along with the active guards. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and his hands moved slightly as if he were carrying a rifle himself. When the moment came for the guards to present arms, something extraordinary happened. The elderly veteran, despite his physical limitations and the awkward position of being seated in a wheelchair, slowly and carefully raised his right hand in a perfect military salute. His movements were deliberate and precise, showing muscle memory that had survived decades since his active service. The salute was directed specifically at Patterson, a gesture of respect from one soldier to another that transcended the years between their service. The old man's grandson stood behind the wheelchair, clearly moved by witnessing this display of military respect and tradition from his grandfather. Patterson faced a moment that would define how he understood his role as a ceremonial guard. According to strict protocol, he should ignore the veteran's salute completely, maintaining the same neutral expression and motionless posture that he showed to all spectators. Acknowledging the salute, even slightly, would be a breach of conduct that could result in disciplinary action. But looking at this elderly man, struggling to maintain his salute despite obvious physical discomfort, Patterson saw something that transcended normal tourist interactions. This wasn't someone seeking entertainment or trying to provoke a reaction. This was a fellow soldier showing respect based on shared experience and mutual understanding of what military service meant. For several seconds, The veteran held his salute while Patterson remained motionless according to protocol. The contrast was striking. The elderly man's obvious effort to honor military tradition despite his physical limitations, while the active guard was prevented by regulations from acknowledging this gesture of respect. Patterson made a decision that would resonate far beyond this single ceremony. Moving only his eyes, he made direct contact with the veteran's gaze. Then, in the smallest possible movement that would still be recognizable as military acknowledgement, Patterson nodded. It was barely perceptible to casual observers, but unmistakably a return of the veteran's salute. The effect on the elderly man was immediate and profound. His eyes brightened with an emotion that seemed to combine gratitude, pride, and recognition. He completed his salute with renewed vigor, then slowly lowered his hand to his wheelchair armrest. For the rest of the ceremony, he sat with visible satisfaction, having received the acknowledgement that one soldier gives to another. The grandson had witnessed the entire exchange and understood its significance even without military experience. He leaned down to his grandfather and whispered, "He saluted you back, didn't he, Grandpa?" "Indeed he did, Tommy. That young man understands what service means. He knows that some traditions are more important than regulations." The veteran's voice carried deep satisfaction as he watched Patterson complete the remainder of his ceremonial duties. Several other spectators had noticed the exchange, though most probably didn't understand its full significance. A few people had captured photos or videos of the moment when the elderly man saluted, but the guard's subtle response was too slight to be clearly visible in most recordings. After the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, the veteran and his grandson remained near Patterson's position for a few extra minutes. The old man seemed reluctant to leave, as if this connection to his own military past was too precious to abandon quickly. "Thank you, soldier," the veteran said quietly, just loud enough for Patterson to hear as they finally prepared to leave. It's good to know that respect and honor still mean something to the young generation. Patterson remained at attention until his shift ended, but the encounter with the veteran had fundamentally changed how he thought about his role. He realized that his ceremonial duties weren't just about maintaining traditions or providing entertainment for tourists. They were about embodying values and principles that connected current soldiers with generations of those who had served before them. The brief exchange of salutes had created a bridge across decades, linking the experiences of a World War II veteran with a current guard and demonstrating that military respect and brotherhood transcended specific conflicts or eras. Patterson's small breach of protocol had honored something larger than regulations. It had honored the continuous tradition of service that both men represented. Years later, Patterson would learn that the elderly veteran had spoken about that day until his death, telling family members and fellow veterans about the young guard who had shown him proper military respect. For both men, the moment had confirmed that some values are timeless and that true military courtesy sometimes requires going beyond written rules to recognize the deeper principles that unite all those who serve. Within hours of the various incidents involving guards breaking protocol, the military hierarchy faced an unprecedented situation. Social media platforms were flooding with videos, photos, and stories of royal guards showing human compassion during their ceremonial duties. The response from the public was overwhelmingly positive, but military regulations remained clear about the consequences of breaking established protocols. Colonel Andrews, who oversaw the ceremonial guard program, found himself dealing with multiple cases simultaneously. Thompson's acceptance of the flower from the child with Down syndrome, Rodriguez's life-saving CPR on the collapsed tourist, Williams's assistance in finding the missing child, and Patterson's acknowledgement of the veteran's salute. Each incident represented a clear violation of standing orders, yet each had generated widespread public praise. The disciplinary hearings began within a week of the incidents. Each guard was called to explain their actions and face potential consequences that could range from formal reprimands to removal from ceremonial duties entirely. For career soldiers who had worked years to earn their positions as royal guards, these hearings represented a serious threat to their professional futures. Thompson was the first to face the disciplinary panel. He sat in his dress uniform across from 3 senior officers, knowing that his moment of acknowledgement toward the little girl had been captured on dozens of cameras and viewed by millions of people worldwide. The evidence against him was indisputable. He had clearly broken his stance and acknowledged a member of the public during ceremonial duties. "Guard Thompson," Colonel Andrews began, "you understand that your actions, while well-intentioned, represent a clear breach of protocol. Our ceremonial duties require absolute consistency and discipline. When one guard breaks protocol, it potentially undermines the entire program." Thompson nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. I understand the seriousness of my actions. However, I believe that in that particular moment, acknowledging the child's gesture was the right thing to do. She wasn't seeking entertainment or trying to provoke a reaction. She was showing genuine gratitude for our service." The panel reviewed the extensive video evidence and read statements from witnesses. What they found was remarkable. Not a single person who had witnessed the incident criticized Thompson's behavior. Instead, hundreds of comments praised both the child's sweetness and the guard's humanity. Similar hearings were conducted for the other guards. Rodriguez faced questions about abandoning his post to save the tourist's life. "Sir, I understood that leaving my position violated protocol," he told the panel. "But I had a choice between following regulations and potentially watching someone die when I had the training to help. I chose to prioritize human life." The tourist Rodriguez had saved had made a full recovery and submitted a formal letter to the military expressing his gratitude. His family had also started an online petition requesting that Rodriguez be commended rather than punished for his actions. The petition had gathered over 50,000 signatures in just a few days. Williams defended her decision to help coordinate the search for the missing child. "I maintained my position and continued my security duties while providing assistance through proper channels," she explained. "I believe I found a way to help a family in crisis without compromising the ceremony or my responsibilities." Patterson's hearing focused on his acknowledgement of the veteran's salute. The man was a former Coldstream Guard who had served in this same capacity after World War II, Patterson told the panel. "His salute was a gesture of respect between soldiers, and I felt that completely ignoring it would have been disrespectful to his service and our shared military heritage." While the hearings were taking place, public support for the guards continued to grow. Social media campaigns emerged using hashtags like #SureHumanityFirst and Dear Guards with Hearts. People shared their own stories of small acts of kindness that had meant everything to them. Military veterans from around the world posted messages supporting the guards' decisions to show compassion while maintaining their duties. News organizations picked up the story, and it quickly became an international phenomenon. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, with commentators praising the guards for proving that military discipline and human compassion could coexist. Editorial writers argued that the incidents had actually enhanced public respect for the monarchy and the military, rather than undermining it. The royal household found itself in a delicate position. They needed to maintain military discipline and the dignity of ceremonial traditions, but they also couldn't ignore the fact that these protocol breaches had generated more positive publicity than years of perfectly executed ceremonies. Private polling showed that public approval for the royal guards had reached the highest levels in decades. Behind the scenes, senior palace officials were reviewing decades of protocol and tradition, trying to find precedents for how to handle guards who had technically violated regulations while performing acts that the public universally praised. The situation was further complicated by the fact that each incident involved different circumstances and different degrees of protocol violation. Support for the guards came from unexpected quarters. Retired military officers wrote letters defending the guards' actions, arguing that military service had always required good judgment and moral courage, not just blind obedience to regulations. Several members of Parliament raised questions about whether military protocols needed to be updated to reflect modern expectations about humanitarian behavior. The families of the people, who had been helped by the guards, became vocal advocates for the soldiers who had assisted them. The parents of the little girl with Down syndrome appeared on television to thank Thompson for his kindness toward their daughter. The tourist who had been saved by Rodriguez's CPR traveled back to London, specifically to speak on the guards' behalf. International military organizations also weighed in on the controversy. A group of NATO military leaders issued a statement praising the guards for demonstrating that well-trained soldiers could maintain discipline while showing appropriate compassion. They argued that the incidents showed strength rather than weakness in British military training. The pressure on military leadership became intense. Colonel Andrews found himself fielding calls from politicians, journalists, and advocacy groups, all wanting to know how the military planned to respond to guards who had become international heroes for their acts of kindness. The situation had evolved far beyond a simple disciplinary matter. Public demonstrations of support began appearing outside military bases and royal residences. People brought flowers, cards, and signs thanking the guards for their service and their humanity. Veterans organizations organized rallies supporting the guards' decisions to prioritize human welfare over rigid protocol adherence. The tourism industry also noticed the positive impact. Tour operators reported increased bookings for visits to royal residences, with many visitors specifically mentioning their desire to see the guards who had shown such compassion. Gift shops began selling postcards and souvenirs featuring images from the viral incident's military. Recruitment offices reported a significant increase in inquiries from young people who said they were inspired by the guards' examples of service that combined discipline with compassion. The incidents had apparently enhanced rather than damaged the reputation of military service among potential recruits. Social media analysis showed that the positive coverage of the guards had reached over 100 million people worldwide. The stories had been translated into dozens of languages and shared across every major platform. Marketing experts calculated that the positive publicity was worth millions of dollars in terms of improving Britain's international image. As the disciplinary process continued, it became clear that the military leadership faced an unprecedented challenge. They needed to uphold standards and maintain discipline, but they also had to acknowledge that these particular protocol breaches had generated more goodwill and positive attention than decades of perfect ceremonial performance. The resolution of these cases would ultimately set precedents for how future incidents would be handled and whether the rigid protocols governing royal guards could be modified to allow for basic humanitarian responses without compromising the dignity and effectiveness of their ceremonial role. The entire situation had evolved into a test case for balancing tradition with humanity in modern military service. The royal household's response to the protocol breach incidents came after weeks of careful deliberation involving military leaders, palace officials, and even members of the royal family themselves. What emerged was a groundbreaking reassessment of how ceremonial duties could be performed while maintaining both tradition and basic human decency. Colonel Andrews announced the decisions in a private meeting with the 4 guards who had been facing disciplinary action. The room was tense as Thompson, Rodriguez, Williams, and Patterson stood at attention, awaiting news that could determine their military futures. Each man and woman had spent sleepless nights wondering whether their moments of compassion would cost them careers they had worked years to build. After extensive review and consultation, Colonel Andrews began, "The royal household has decided that your actions, while technically in violation of existing protocols, demonstrated the kind of judgment and moral courage that represents the best traditions of military service. You will receive formal commendations rather than disciplinary action." The relief in the room was palpable, but Colonel Andrews continued with more significant news. "Furthermore, your cases have prompted a comprehensive review of our ceremonial protocols. We are implementing new guidelines that will allow guards to respond appropriately to humanitarian situations without abandoning their core duties." The new protocols represented a careful balance between maintaining ceremonial dignity and acknowledging that guards were human beings with natural instincts to help others in distress. The changes were subtle but meaningful, providing official guidance for situations that had previously existed in a regulatory gray area. Guards would now receive training in recognizing genuine emergency situations versus attention-seeking behavior from tourists. They would learn specific procedures for summoning assistance while maintaining their posts, and they would be given explicit permission to acknowledge certain types of respectful gestures without facing disciplinary action. The most significant change involved medical emergencies. Guards would be authorized to leave their posts to provide life-saving assistance if no other help was immediately available, with the understanding that preserving human life took precedence over ceremonial duties. This change directly addressed the situation Rodriguez had faced when saving the tourist's life. For situations involving lost children, guards received new protocols for alerting security while maintaining their positions. Williams's handling of the missing child case became a model, for how guards could assist families in crisis without abandoning their security responsibilities. The new guidelines also addressed interactions with military, veterans, and active service members. Guards would be permitted to acknowledge salutes from fellow soldiers in ways that maintained ceremonial dignity while showing appropriate military courtesy. Patterson's exchange with the elderly veteran was specifically cited as an example of proper military respect. Perhaps most importantly, the revised protocols included guidance for responding to genuine gestures of gratitude and respect from the public. While guards would continue to ignore attempts to provoke reactions or disruptions, they would be allowed to acknowledge sincere expressions of appreciation in minimal but meaningful ways. The implementation of these changes required extensive retraining for all ceremonial guards. Senior guards who had served for decades had to learn new approaches to situations they had previously handled through strict adherence to unchanging protocols. For many, this represented a significant shift in how they understood their role. Guard Martinez, a 10-year veteran of ceremonial duties, described the adjustment period. At first, it felt strange to be told that we could show some flexibility in our responses. We had been trained for so long to maintain absolute consistency that any variation felt wrong. But the new training helped us understand that we weren't abandoning our standards, we were refining them. The training scenarios became more sophisticated, incorporating role-playing exercises where guards practiced responding to various humanitarian situations. Instructors worked with guards to develop judgment, skills that would help them distinguish between genuine emergencies and tourist antics designed to provoke reactions. Medical training was expanded for all ceremonial guards, ensuring that they could provide basic first aid and CPR while wearing their formal uniforms and equipment. Guards learned how to maintain their ceremonial bearing even while responding to medical emergencies, preserving the dignity of their role while potentially saving lives. The psychological aspects of the new protocols were also addressed. Guards received counseling about the emotional challenges of maintaining professional composure while witnessing human suffering or distress. They learned techniques for processing these experiences without becoming hardened or emotionally detached from their humanitarian responsibilities. Public reaction to the protocol changes was overwhelmingly positive. Military historians noted that this represented the most significant evolution in Royal Guard procedures in over a century, demonstrating that even the most traditional institutions could adapt to changing social expectations without losing their essential character. Tourism increased significantly following the implementation of the new protocols. Visitors came specifically hoping to witness the more human side of the guards, while still experiencing the traditional pageantry and ceremony. The guards found themselves serving as ambassadors not just for the monarchy, but for British values of combining duty with compassion. The international military community took notice of Britain's approach to balancing tradition with humanity. Several other countries began reviewing their own ceremonial protocols, considering whether similar adjustments might improve their effectiveness while maintaining military standards. Guard training programs expanded to include modules on cultural sensitivity and public relations. Guards learned about the diverse backgrounds of international visitors and how to respond appropriately to different cultural expressions of respect and gratitude. This training proved particularly valuable given the global nature of tourism to royal sites. The changes also affected recruitment for ceremonial positions. Military leaders found that the new protocols attracted candidates who were drawn to the combination of military discipline and opportunities for meaningful human interaction. The Guard program began attracting soldiers who saw ceremonial duty as a way to serve their country while maintaining their humanity. Veteran guards noticed changes in how they felt about their service. Many reported feeling less isolated and more connected to the public they served. The ability to show appropriate compassion during their duties helped guards maintain emotional well-being during long hours of ceremonial performance. The royal family themselves expressed support for the protocol changes. In private conversations with military leaders, members of the royal household indicated that they appreciated having guards who could represent both the dignity of the monarchy and the compassionate values that the institution sought to embody. Media coverage of the protocol evolution continued for months, with journalists documenting how the new guidelines were being implemented in practice. Stories emerged of guards helping elderly tourists with directions, acknowledging children's respectful waves, and providing assistance during minor emergencies, all while maintaining their ceremonial duties. The success of the new protocols validated the decisions made by Thompson, Rodriguez, Williams, and Patterson. Their moments of breaking traditional protocol had sparked changes that improved the Guard program while maintaining its essential character and effectiveness. Military educators began studying the British experience as an example of how traditional institutions could evolve in response to changing social expectations. The case became a model for other organizations facing similar challenges in balancing established procedures with humanitarian values. The Guards themselves became advocates for the new approach, sharing their experiences with new recruits and helping to establish the cultural shift within the ceremonial Guard community. They had learned that showing appropriate compassion didn't weaken their military effectiveness. It enhanced their ability to serve as representatives of the best qualities of their nation and its institutions. 6 months after the implementation of the new protocols, the transformation in how Royal Guards performed their duties had become evident to everyone who visited the ceremonial sites. The changes were subtle but profound, creating an atmosphere where military precision coexisted naturally with human warmth and compassion. Thompson had completed his service as a ceremonial guard and transitioned to a training role, helping to implement the new protocols with incoming guards. His experience with the little girl and her flower had become a cornerstone example in the training curriculum, demonstrating how guards could maintain their dignity while acknowledging genuine human connection. During one of his training sessions, Thompson shared the story with a group of new recruits. The most important thing to understand, he told them, is that we're not just ceremonial statues. We're representatives of values that include both strength and compassion. Learning to balance these isn't weakness. It's the highest form of military professionalism. The little girl who had offered Thompson the flower had become something of a celebrity in her own right. Her family had been invited to several ceremonial events, and she had developed a genuine friendship with Thompson even after his retirement from active guard duty. The pressed flower he had kept from that day remained in a frame on his desk, a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. Rodriguez had returned to active ceremonial duties and had since used his medical training to assist in 2 more emergency situations. Each time he was able to provide help, while following the new protocols that allowed for humanitarian assistance without abandoning security responsibilities. His quick thinking and medical skills had saved multiple lives, and he had become an advocate for expanded medical training for all ceremonial guards. The tourist whose life Rodriguez had saved made an annual trip to London specifically to visit the guard who had performed CPR on him. The 2 men had developed an unlikely friendship that transcended their initial emergency encounter. The tourist often brought his grandchildren to meet Rodriguez, telling them the story of how a Royal Guard had saved his life by choosing compassion over protocol. Williams had been promoted to a senior position within the ceremonial guard program. Partly due to her excellent handling of the missing child situation, she now helped coordinate security for major events, while also serving as a liaison between guards and families who encountered difficulties during ceremonial occasions. Her ability to provide assistance while maintaining security had become a model for other guards. The missing child case had led to improved coordination between ceremonial guards and family services personnel at major events. Williams had helped develop new procedures that ensured lost children could be reunited with their families quickly without disrupting ceremonial activities or compromising security. Patterson continued his ceremonial duties with a deeper understanding of the connections between past and present military service. The encounter with the elderly veteran had led him to volunteer with veterans organizations during his off-duty time, helping to bridge the gap between different generations of soldiers. His respectful acknowledgement of the veteran's salute had become an example of how military courtesy could transcend regulatory constraints. The elderly veteran had passed away peacefully several months after his encounter with Patterson, but his family maintained contact with the guard, who had shown their grandfather such respect. At the veteran's funeral, Patterson served as an honorary pallbearer, representing the connection between soldiers across different eras of service. The cumulative effect of these individual stories had created a fundamental shift in how the public perceived Royal Guards. Instead of seeing them as inflexible symbols of outdated tradition, people now viewed them as representatives of enduring values that included both discipline and human decency. This change in perception had strengthened rather than weakened the respect for the institution. Tourism to royal sites had increased significantly, with many visitors specifically hoping to witness the more human side of the guards while still experiencing traditional ceremony. Tour guides now included stories of guards' humanitarian actions in their presentations, using these examples to illustrate how British values combined strength with compassion. The international impact of the protocol changes had been remarkable. Military delegations from other countries visited Britain to study the new approach to ceremonial duties. Several nations implemented similar modifications to their own ceremonial protocols, recognizing that showing appropriate humanity could enhance rather than diminish military traditions. Military recruitment had benefited from the positive publicity surrounding the Guards' actions. Young people who might have been deterred by perceptions of rigid, unfeeling military service were now attracted to an institution that demonstrated the possibility of combining disciplined service with compassionate action. The Guards themselves reported higher job satisfaction and better mental health since the protocol changes were implemented. The ability to respond appropriately to human needs had reduced the emotional stress of maintaining complete detachment from the suffering or joy of others. Guards felt more connected to their communities and more proud of their service. Training programs had evolved to include extensive education about the historical context of military service and the values that ceremonial guards represented. New guards learned not just the mechanical aspects of their duties, but also the philosophical foundations that made their service meaningful to both themselves and the public. The story of the protocol changes had been documented in books, documentaries, and academic studies examining how traditional institutions could adapt to changing social expectations. Military historians noted that the British experience demonstrated that evolution and tradition were not necessarily contradictory forces. Children who visited royal sites now saw guards who could acknowledge their presence appropriately while maintaining their ceremonial roles. This had led to increased respect for military service among young people, who could see guards as both disciplined professionals and caring human beings. The four guards, whose initial actions had sparked these changes, remained connected through their shared experience of challenging tradition in service of higher values. They occasionally met to discuss how the new protocols were working and to share stories of meaningful interactions they had experienced with the public. Educational institutions began using the Royal Guard story as a case study in ethical leadership and moral courage. Business schools and military academies examined how the Guards had navigated the tension between following rules and doing what they believed was right. Using their experience to teach students about principled decision-making, the royal household had publicly expressed satisfaction with how the protocol changes had enhanced rather than diminished the dignity of ceremonial occasions. Members of the royal family noted that having guards who could represent both traditional values and human compassion better reflected the monarchy's role in modern society. 5 years after the initial incidents, the new approach to ceremonial guard duties had become so well established that younger guards couldn't imagine operating under the old, rigid protocols. The changes had been fully integrated into guard culture, creating a new tradition that honored both military discipline and human decency. The legacy of those first moments of compassion had proven that sometimes the greatest service to tradition comes from having the courage to evolve it. The Guards had shown that strength and kindness, discipline and humanity, protocol and compassion could coexist in ways that honored the past while serving the needs of the present. The story continued to inspire people around the world who faced their own challenges in balancing institutional demands with human values. The Guards had demonstrated that individual acts of courage and compassion, even when they involved breaking established rules, could lead to positive changes that benefited everyone. In the end, the rare times when royal guards broke protocol to show humanity had become the foundation for a new understanding of what true service meant. Not just following orders, but having the wisdom and courage to know when higher principles demanded a different response.